Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. If you thought you could escape analysis of the 2021 Senedd election, you have come to the wrong place. Joining us this evening to talk through his research on the Welsh election study is James Griffiths, a PhD student in politics at the University of Manchester, who is researching national identity and sub-state nationalism. Hello, James.
Hi, okay there.
Very well. Thank you very much for joining us. So your research was on the Welsh election study. Would you be able to explain a little bit about what that study is and how big the sample is of voters, etc., that you've drawn these conclusions from?
Yeah, so the Welsh election study is a study that's hosted out of Cardiff, which I have been helping on over the last couple of months. The Welsh election study focuses on, obviously, Welsh elections, having previous studies in 2003, 7, 11, 16, one for the 2019 general election, and then one for the Senedd election that's just gone. The 2021 survey covers around 4,000 participants from Wales and covers a variety of topics from coronavirus to voting intention to how you feel about political parties to what you think the national sport of Wales is. So it's a wide breadth of interesting topics that a lot of research will be coming out on in the near future.
In your blog that covered the study, you said that Wales is sleepwalking to independence. Would you be able to explain a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah, so the term sleepwalking is lifted from a speech that Mark Drakeford made in, I believe, the House of Lords very recently, where he said that the United Kingdom was sleepwalking towards dissolution. With the case of Wales, I think that the term sleepwalking is quite apt because I go over this in the blog, but after a long period of stability, attitudes towards independence appear to have changed in recent years, particularly after 2016, where support has been steadily increasing. However, this support, unlike in Scotland, where independence is incredibly salient territorial cleavage, independence in Wales, while important to many people, does not appear to be as salient a cleavage at this point. Lots of people may be becoming more favourable or more supportive of independence, but that does not necessarily mean that independence is a priority for them right now. Hence, these kind of changes in attitudes may be going on under the surface at the moment.
How does polling for independence compare to other constitutional preferences, James?
It depends on the measure that you use, but if you look at so there's a measure which is often used, taken from the British Social Attitude Survey, which asks respondents whether they support independence inside or outside the EU, whether they support the existence of the Senedd with or without tax powers, or whether they support abolishing the Senedd entirely. So at the moment, attitudes towards independence are similar to attitudes towards abolish, with around a quarter of respondents in the 2021 survey supporting either independence or abolish. The majority of people in Wales support the existence of the Senedd with tax-raising powers or with power over tax in Wales. However, when you then look at independence, it really depends on what type of independence you're talking about. Support for independence outside the EU is very low. Only around 5% of the Welsh electorate support an independent Wales outside the European Union. That hasn't really changed since 2007. What has changed is that support for an independent Wales inside the EU, that has increased from around just over 5% to about 20% or so now. So that has changed rather dramatically.
It's very interesting that, though, isn't it? Because, so much is made about the independence movement and whether it offers a vision for the future of Wales in concrete, tangible terms, or whether it just talks about the idea of being independent. From your research, it seems quite clear that in order to advance itself, the Welsh independence movement really does need to kind of be a pro-EU movement.
Well, this is the thing, is that on the surface, it appears that the people who have become more supportive of independence, and when I say more supportive, I mean people who have either didn't support independence in 2016, but now do, or people who, on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being abolish the Senedd, 10 being support independence, people who've moved along the scale towards independence, those people who've become more supportive tend to support Remain, or tend to have voted Remain in 2016. The difficulty is that Brexit and independence, in Scotland at least, those two issues can really divide each other, and you have a rather significant portion of the independence movement in Scotland that supports Brexit. So while the SNP may be a pro-EU party, it can make things a bit difficult difficult in trying to mobilise independence if you mobilise a version of independence that is entirely focused on the EU. I think right now it is possible that we might see similar things in Wales, but it does look like there will be more utility in pushing that pro-European vision right now, with potential caveats for the future.
Parties advocating independence only got about 20% of the vote in the Senedd election, though, James. How can that really be a mandate for increased support for independence? Surely if you want independence, you've got to vote for it. Plaid Cymru got a lower percentage of the vote than they did in the 2016 election. Even if independence is growing, that isn't really turning into votes, is it?
No, it isn't. Plaid don't seem to be benefiting from this increased support and independence at the moment. And part of the reason for that is, if you look at these recent converts to independence, or the people who've become more supportive at least, a significant portion, nearly half of them, voted for Labour in the 2021 election. Now, it seems a little bit contradictory that a person who supports independence would vote for a party that supports the union. But I feel that part of that is happening because Welsh Labour have made have been really successful at marketing themselves as a Welsh party. Rhodri Morgan talked about creating clear red water between them and Westminster, and people do see them as standing up for Welsh interests, a similar level to, this isn't in the blog, but a similar level to Plaid. I think another reason why this increased support for independence isn't translating into Plaid support is that independence isn't a priority for these people at the moment. The Welsh Governance Centre posted about it, saying that for many people in Wales, other things matter right now, things like health or the economy. And while these people may support independence, they're not going to vote based on that opinion right now. Obviously, we see that may change, but I think that's where Plaid are struggling to attract these recent converts.
Do you think that the reason that Plaid are failing to win these people over is because they're looking at them like Plaid voters? Because they support independence, they think they support independence for the same reason that people who traditionally vote Plaid do, whereas actually what these people are people who are looking for a route to socialism through an independent Wales, and Plaid have completely misunderstood who these voters are and what their priorities are.
Well, I can't comment on Plaid strategies or how they view these voters, but I do think that it's important to stress that these recent converts are very different to the more long-standing independent supporters. One of the really key ways in which these individuals are different is that these recent converts are far more British. These people who now have moved over towards supporting independence, they tend to prioritise their Welsh identity, but they still have very strong British identities, which means that, making kind of identity-based claims isn't necessarily going to resonate with them in the same way that it would with more long-standing supporters.
That's quite interesting, though, isn't it? Because I'm sure we've all seen the data, and I'm sure that the kind of people who are listening to us now have a vague idea of what we're talking about when we do. The idea that people who identify exclusively as Welsh tend to vote more often than not for Plaid Cymru. Those who are more Welsh than British tend to vote Labour, and those who are more British than Welsh or exclusively British tend to vote Conservative. Where's the cut-off point in this independent support? Because my logic would say that it starts to go gradually down from exclusively Welsh down to more Welsh than British, and it sort of levels off to nothingness when you get to exclusively British. But is that true? Are there people who are equally Welsh and British still supporting independence, or are there those who are exclusively British who back independence?
Very few people who are exclusively British supporting independence, but you do find a large portion of individuals who are who have dual Welsh and British identities supporting independence, those tend to be found more often among the recent converts to independence, which is interesting because it seems to be that these individuals simultaneously support separation from a state, but also continue to identify quite strongly with that state. And part of that may be that they have different reasons for wanting independence. As you touched on, it may be that they are looking for a route of installing socialism, or potentially they see independence for Wales as a route back into the EU. So because of their different motivations, the supposed competition between their Welsh and British identities isn't that being British doesn't have to rule out the possibility of supporting independence, which does seem contradictory. But part of that may also be that these people aren't having to make that choice right now because independence isn't a priority for them. One thing that you find, it isn't in the blog, but you find that is since 2016, people who have switched towards independence have become less British. The strength of their British identity has decreased, but they still remain very strongly British. So it may be that we're starting to see that there is a competition here, that people are starting to see that their support for independence may not be compatible. So if independence becomes salient, we may see them move away from Britishness, but there needs to be further research on that.
To what extent do you think that the idea and concept of Welshness and Britishness have changed in the last few years? Do you think there are now different concepts in 2021 to when they were in sort of 2016, the year of the Brexit referendum?
I don't necessarily think that Welshness has changed, but I think that there are a lot of people who have changed there have started to become changes in viewing how compatible Britishness is. Thinking back to 2012, when you had things like the London Olympics, and it was a big celebration of an inclusive vision of Britishness. But since then, we've had the Brexit referendum, which associates with national identity. Ailsa Henderson and others have looked at how British identity associates with supporting Leave in Scotland and Wales, whereas Welshness and Scottishness associates with voting Remain. Since then, we've had a Conservative Party who have adopted a form of kind of muscular unionism, an attempt to kind of stress that there are no differences, or there should be no differences. And those kind of things, there is a lot of research on by people like Harlow Baster, that when you have a centre that is stressing that, oh, well, we're all one nation and there are no differences, it can create a kind of backlash where people then start going, well, no, and they push back off that and think, well, no, actually, we are different. So it may necessarily be that as we've started to see these kind of more aggressive forms of unionism, we may then be seeing people reacting against that. But yeah, that's my form of speculation on that.
You talk a little bit about how support for independence is different in Wales than it is in Scotland, because in Scotland it's a very germane issue. The likelihood of a referendum much more real. So do you think that support for independence in Wales is softer than it is in Scotland?
It very possibly may be softer. I think that there is a incredibly strong support for devolution and a strong support for a Welsh voice and Welsh representation within Wales. I think that things like Brexit and potentially challenges to this devolution through the pandemic may kind of push people, or make people think about how tenable their support for devolution is, or how whether or not it can be kind of sustained in face of that pressure. But I think in Wales that at the moment, if people were given the choice, they are going to lump for stronger powers rather than necessarily independence.
On that basis, how long do you think that Welsh Labour's soft nationalism will work? Do you think there's ever a chance that people will start switching to Plaid Cymru or the Greens?
I think if independence becomes a cleavage where these people start voting on that basis. If independence becomes a more salient cleavage, then that pro-union, soft nationalist position becomes far more difficult to hold. Now, there are other difficulties with Scottish Labour and their kind of campaigns in the early 2010s. But researchers like Ed Fieldhouse and Chris Prosser look at how Scottish Labour found themselves stuck between their pro-union position and their left-wing position. And they're standing on a stage with the Conservatives and the Lib Dems in the 2014 referendum campaign, pushed a lot of their voters, particularly left-wing voters, away from them towards the SNP. If independence became such a salient cleavage that Labour were forced to stand on a stage with the Welsh Conservatives, then that distinctness, that ability for Welsh Labour to say, no, we are different, becomes harder to claim. However, that does rely on independence becoming much more salient and the people starting to prioritise that first.
What impact do you think a Labour government in Westminster would have on that support? Do you think that if Labour voters saw a route to a more socialist, social democratic government through a Westminster system, their support for independence would diminish?
So I'll preface this by saying I think there needs to be a lot more research on the motivations for people supporting independence, and certainly on, as you said, how soft or how sticky this support is, which hopefully will come. But I think it would depend on, if there were a Labour government, how that Labour government treated the devolved parliaments, how their attitude was towards the Senedd. Because if you have a Labour government, but you then don't see progress, you don't see, for argument's sake, because Brexit seems to be such an important thing that's kind of driving people towards independence, if you don't see moves towards Europe, or you don't see the extension of powers to devolved parliaments, then potentially the presence of a Labour government in Westminster may not provide these people with that alternative that they need to kind of dissuade them from supporting independence.
Whilst the data on independence has probably caused the most recently, you've also recently done some work on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic management has had on voter intention. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so me and Jack Larner, who is at Cardiff, we are working on a paper at the moment which looks at whether evaluations of how the devolved and UK governments, the evaluations of their handling of the pandemic, whether they have had an effect on vote intention. And it does seem to be that people who think that the Welsh government, the Scottish government, or the UK government, people who think that they have done a good job at handling the pandemic, are more likely to vote for them in an election. However, there are some important caveats here, which is that these evaluations seem to be influenced more by your pre-existing identities than any kind of material reality of the pandemic. So, for example, whether you lost your job, lost your income, received furlough, whether you had coronavirus to any degree, whether you know someone who had coronavirus to any degree, those things don't influence whether or not you think the government has done a good job. Instead, your evaluations of whether or not the Welsh government or the UK government have done a good job associate with your national identity, your party identity, and your Brexit position. So what we may be seeing instead is that people are rallying around their side, and instead of evaluating the government on their performance, are instead using these markers to say, I liked them before, I think they're doing a good job. People talk about a rally around the flag effect, which may be something that we're seeing.
On that point, is it a rally around the flag? Is it a rally around the incumbent government? Or is it a rally around your side, the people you liked already? What would you say is more accurate?
I'd argue that it's a rally around your side rather than necessarily the flag, because if you look at Wales, for an example, you see the opposite trends for the Welsh government and the UK government, with Conservative voters, for example, evaluating the UK government well, but the Welsh government poorly. British identifiers tend to evaluate the UK government well. Welsh identifiers tend to evaluate the UK government poorly. I think the one way you see that it's particularly your side rather than the incumbent is when it comes to Brexit position, where Leave voters are far more likely to say that the UK government has done a good job in England, Scotland, and Wales than Remain voters are. But the opposite is then true of the Scottish and Welsh governments, where the incumbents in Scotland and Wales both have criticised Brexit, and it seems to be that then Leave voters have recognised that and are not evaluating them as well.
What kind of conclusions can we draw from the data then about the Welsh voter, the average Welsh voter? Is there such a thing? Or are we as diverse and confusing a cohort as larger electorates?
I think that there's a lot of diversity amongst the Welsh electorate. I think that not only, if you just look at national identity, not only do you have the cross-section of British and Welsh identifiers, you also have a very, very large portion of individuals who identify as English, and very strongly English. And that kind of separates Wales, certainly from England and also from Scotland, in that you have those three national identities that interact and compete potentially with each other in different ways. This is something I'm kind of looking into more in my PhD, but I think what is going to be interesting is how these identities interact as these territorial issues become more important, which, seeing as recent studies have talked about how large the economic impact of Brexit is going to be on Wales, and how that may then be politicised in terms of the independence movement, we may see that the Welsh voter starts being pulled in very different directions, which may be interesting in the future.
Do you think then that the nations of Britain, as has been previously stated by people like Richard Wyn-Jones, are now represented by their national parties? That the Conservative Party is the National Party of England, that the SNP is the National Party of Scotland, and Welsh Labour is the National Party of Wales?
I think that's certainly how Welsh Labour and the SNP present themselves. I think it's more difficult when talking about the Conservatives. People like Michael Kenny and obviously Richard Wyn-Jones and Ailsa Henderson's book on Englishness talk about the Conservative Party and their kind of attempts to mobilise Englishness, but they are also a British nationalist party in lots of ways. They talk about the union, they talk about how Britain is better together, but it's often through a lot of references to when they talk about British history, it's English history. When they talk about British values, they tend to be referencing things that are associating with England. So while the Conservatives are ultimately a British party, I think the type of Britishness that they kind of express is a very English vision.
How are these all reconciled? Because if you talk to a Welsh Labour politician, they think they talk about Britishness too. They talk about Britain. But how different are the versions of a Conservative Britain and a Labour Britain?
I think they're very different. I think they're very different on the ground as well. And you see that in that Britishness associates with very different things depending on where you are. Britishness in England associates with a singular form of Britishness associates with being Remain, being left-wing, a kind of cosmopolitan vision, whereas Britishness in Scotland and Wales tends to associate with a more conservative, right-wing, Leave voting view. And it's hard to reconcile them if you're trying to mobilise a Britain, or if you're trying to mobilise this image of one Britain. That's going to be very hard to do when what that Britain means is very different, particularly in the largest territory of the United Kingdom.
Well, James, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. We will ensure to include your work on the Welsh election study in our show notes. If people want to hear more from you, where can they go to hear you, for example, on Twitter?
So my handle is at James David Griff with 2 Fs. And you'll find me there talking about Welsh politics and Welsh football.
Well, perfect combination. Thank you very much, James. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find us on Medium at Hiraethblog Cymru, on Facebook at Hiraethblog Cymru, and on Twitter at Hiraethblog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.